What goes on in Washington and what goes on at your state capitol? All of these federal and state government officials, what are they doing? Why do we need so many of them? Well, primarily, they're passing new laws. Law after law after law, more and more new laws each year. And that raises the question, what is the purpose of all of these new laws? Are they good for us or not? I mean, do we even need all of these laws? We'll talk about that next, but first, as always, we start with our mission. Today we're discussing positive law, those man-made laws which govern our societies. Why are they necessary? And how can we know if they are just or unjust? If we learn this faith, if we live this faith, if we share this faith, what will the next 100 years look like? Join the mission. If you missed the previous video, this is part 7 in our series on Sister Mary O'Brien OP's great book, Christian Social Principles. You can get a copy of this book over at Sophia Press, and we highly recommend that you do. We like this book so much that we're filming this series on the first section of this book, on chapters 1 through 8. This video is on chapter 7. Now, we make videos like this each week. If you want more content like this, please like and subscribe. Now, in the last video, we discussed chapter 6, in which Sister explained how natural law serves as an objective guide to man's end or his goal, to his final happiness. And in this video, we're going to discuss how we derive from natural law what is called positive law, also known as the law of the land or the civil law, the law that governments establish in their land. And we're going to give you principles in this video to determine whether those laws are just and necessary, or whether perhaps maybe they're overbearing or overreaching. Now, we're going to start by touching on what we mentioned in the last video, self-evident first principles. Now, if you recall, self-evident first principles are those things that all humans, wherever they are, should recognize and know to be true. We use the example in that chapter of doing good and avoiding evil. Every human, no matter where they are, should know that they should do good and avoid evil. Now, they may misapprehend what good is, but they still know that principle of doing good and avoiding evil. In this chapter, she's going to use some more principles like being kind, being honest, caring for your offspring. Now, we also spoke in that chapter in the last video on second principles that flow logically from first principles. So if we apply that first principle of doing good and avoiding evil, we can logically reason that we should do no harm to anyone. And then we can logically reason that we should not kill, we should not steal, we should not commit adultery, we should not lie, because all of those things are forms of harming people, which are all forms of evil. And we should always do good and avoid evil. So you see how there's this logical flow from one principle to the other. Now, in this video, we're going to discuss the scenario in which, as you move further and further away from first and second principles into the circumstances of day-to-day life, the circumstances may become so complicated or so confusing that there's this possibility that individuals may not be sure what to do in a particular circumstance. This is the role of positive law, or of civil law, the civil government establishing laws, to help the people in a particular area fulfill their nature to do good and avoid evil when perhaps it's not obvious, it's not clear, it's not self-evident in one particular circumstance or another what it is to be good. Now, Sister says that positive law, she says it puts flesh on the skeletal structure of natural moral law. Now, positive law is necessary for two reasons. First, because of the confusion that we just mentioned, there's always this possibility of error or doubt. And also, if you recall, when we discussed natural moral law in the last video, natural moral law, its focus is primarily on the end goal of man, on his final happiness, on his final end. It doesn't give you a lot of information on the means to get there. So, for example, I'll use the example, I live in Tennessee, not too far away from Nashville. Now, if my end goal is to go into Nashville, the means by which I will accomplish that goal, there are many there's a variety of options I can take. I could walk, I could ride a bike, I could drive a car, I could take a bus. All of those are options that I have. Now, which one of those options is proper and most prudent in the circumstances that I find myself in, that's going to vary. So walking is too far, so is riding a bike. Driving a car is probably going to be the best option. We don't have a bus that travels from where I'm at to downtown Nashville. Now, so I'm going to have to pick the particular means that's going to work with the circumstances of where I'm at, in the circumstances of where I live, and the circumstances of my day-to-day life. Now, following St. Thomas Aquinas, she's going to define positive law as a dictate or command of reason, which is in harmony with the natural law and therefore with the eternal law, which determines what has been left undetermined in the natural law. So positive law is the means to fulfill natural law. So it's that the means by getting you to your final goal, which is our fulfillment. That's the purpose of natural laws, for us to be fulfilled. Well, the means to get there may vary in particular circumstances. Okay, so to put a little meat on the bone here, a little more meat on the bone, the circumstances in Tennessee by which I will try to fulfill natural law, to fulfill my nature, is going to be quite different than the circumstances in China. They live in completely different circumstances than we do. So the manner in which they will try to fulfill their nature is going to vary than the manner in which I'm going to try to fulfill my nature. Also, a variation in time. If we lived in the Middle Ages, the means by which we would try to fulfill our natures is going to look different than if we lived in modern times as we do today. Now, remember, we're not speaking here about first principles. There's no circumstances that can vary the outcomes of first principles. It is always wrong to kill an innocent human being. It's always wrong to commit adultery. Those first principles and the secondary principles that flow directly from them, they never change under any circumstances at all. It's just these things that we get further and further away from first and second principles. Now, we're going to use the death penalty here as an example. If you've been watching Catholic YouTube recently, you'll see that this has been one of these controversial topics that have been debated back and forth. And I think perhaps some of the people that were participating in these debates, maybe they didn't have this particular piece of information. So Sister explains that positive law does not follow directly from first principles as secondary principles do. So as I just explained, you can kind of create a syllogism with first principles and secondary principles. They flow logically from them. If I should do good and avoid evil, then there is a logic. There's a syllogism you can create logically by which I will not kill an innocent human person. Those things, it logically flows from that. Now, when it comes to positive law, there is not necessarily a logical connection, but instead we have to do what's called determination. We have to determine from what we know as the goal, to the fulfillment of our natures in natural law, how is it possible that we could fulfill our nature in these particular varying circumstances that we find ourselves living in here and now. And she's going to use the example of punishment. So she says that it is an aspect of natural moral law that evildoers ought to be punished. Now that's important because that was part of that debate that many of those Catholic YouTubers were having regarding this issue. It would be an injustice if somebody were to commit a crime and then not be punished. That would be a complete injustice. However, she says, the manner in which they are to be punished may vary from one time or one place. So it may be determined in one time that it is prudent to use the death penalty, and it may be determined in another time or another circumstances that it may be imprudent to use the death penalty and instead opt to have lifelong imprisonment. The circumstances of a particular situation may dictate this. For example, perhaps in the Middle Ages, where the death penalty was more commonly used, the death penalty was a deterrent for further criminals committing particular crimes. Perhaps now, I'm not taking a position on this. I'm just using this as an example. Perhaps now, when we have these massive prisons that nobody could ever break out of, perhaps it's sufficient that somebody is put away for their entirety of their life. I know there's arguments against that, and I'm not taking one position or another. I'm just presenting that as an option here. Okay, this is important. We've been speaking about positive law as if it were only civil law. Those are the examples I've been given. That's not entirely correct. There are two kinds of positive law. There is what is called divine law, and that's going to be laws that are established by perhaps religious officials or church officials, or perhaps even God through divine revelation. The purpose of divine law is the interior life of a particular man. That is different and should be distinguished from what we call human law, or what I've been using the example of civil law. So the governments that are establishing laws of the land, that's properly called human law. The human law should never determine the interior action of a particular man. Human law relates to the common good of all men in general. So I'm going to break this down. She says that divine law curbs man's interior actions, which no legislature can accomplish. That's the purpose of divine law. And she gives the example of the Old Testament law and the New Testament law as two good examples of curbing a man's interior actions. Now, human law, she says, it's not for the purpose of a singular individual man, but for the universal good, the good of the whole community. And this is a really, really important point here, because I think this is something that's been abused, and that's why I gave those teaser questions at the beginning about whether or not we need all of these laws. So there's this term, universal good, and we see a similar term in the preamble to the Constitution called the general welfare. And if you notice, it says general welfare. The term is universal good. But we act as if our government sometimes, I'm not trying to paint a broad brush and accuse every state in the entire union and every federal government that's ever sat. I'm just saying sometimes it seems as though some of the laws that are passed are oriented in such a way that it's as if it says specific welfare or particular welfare, not general welfare. We act as if the preamble says specific welfare or particular welfare, but it doesn't. It says general welfare. St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that laws should be for the common or the universal good. Laws that are oriented towards the community, not towards an individual man. Now, let me give an example here, okay? If I am late for work, I may find it a good for myself that I speed. I may judge that is something that's good for me to do. But in reality, while that might be good for me as an individual, it is detrimental to the general good or the general welfare of the community as a whole. Because while I think it's proper for me to speed because I might get a good out of it, the general welfare, somebody else in the community, could be damaged. And so that would be an abuse for me to decide on my own. It is necessary for me to speed, and so I'm going to make this determination. I'm above the law, so to speak. And we see this very type of thing happening in the way our laws are passed. They don't pertain always, of course. I'm not speaking of everyone. I'm just speaking sometimes. They don't pertain to the general welfare of people. They pertain to specific individuals. Now, if you spend some time thinking about this, if the government is doing this type of action where they're applying laws towards particular individuals, what they're in effect doing is they're robbing an individual man of his ability to take care of himself and his family. And if you think about that, you realize that this kind of overreach robs a man of his dignity. And in another place, I'll read it in a moment, St. Thomas Aquinas will say that this is not law actually, but actually violence. So St. Thomas Aquinas is going to give a couple of guidelines for what true positive law should be. So he says, first, remember that it's based on reason. It's not based on passion. The example that I gave a moment ago of me speeding, that example would be based on my passion. I am afraid of being late for work. Therefore, I deem it good too. But that's based on my passion that I'm experiencing right now, my emotion of fear. It's not based on the logical reason of me being perfected as a human, or of the community being perfected as their human nature being perfected, their pursuit of our pursuit of our final end. I mean, okay, so it's not based on passion. It's not based on emotion. It's based on reason. Second, it must come from him who is legitimately in charge of those of whom he rules. Now, when you think of this, you might think, okay, does this refer to somebody who is not legitimate, somebody who's in office and shouldn't be? Perhaps, but I think it goes beyond that. I think when you have different levels of government, for example, let's say the federal government's an easy example here. If the federal government is reaching down into the local level and ordaining things that relate to roads and schools, things that should be handled at the local level, the Catholic concept of subsidiarity, if you've heard of that before, that's what this is referring to. The federal government does not necessarily have the legitimate authority to reach down to the local level, because it is the federal government that they are charged with governing, not the local level. So to read that again, that for a law to be just, it must come from him who is legitimately in charge of those over whom he rules. Now, third, the law must direct the whole society for the sake of the whole society, not for individuals. So we mentioned this before, but it shouldn't have a special interest group profiting from a particular law because it favors them. Fourth, the law must never be more than the means to the end. It should not be the end in itself. So I think maybe we have this climate now where the government itself is becoming like a religious establishment itself. And the laws that it's passing are now becoming the end goal. We're all working for this end goal. But that the law is a means to the end, the fulfillment of our nature. Number 5, the law, in order for it to be just, must be promulgated. It must be, the people can't follow the law if they don't know that it exists. So Sister quotes St. Thomas Aquinas saying that unless a law does this, it ought to be considered a perversion of law and an act of violence. Now, this brings us to our final point, that human law is not for the purpose of sanctification. I just mentioned this idea. If you really kind of step back and reflect on our culture now, how we all gather around cable news and voting every 2 years in elections, this is becoming a religion for us, and the laws that these people are passing is becoming kind of a religious ritual for us. But positive law is not for the purpose of our individual sanctification. It is not for a particular individual. It is for the community as a whole. Human law, the purpose of human law is to create a society in which the human person, an individual person, can flourish. So it doesn't address the actual individual human person, but the community as a whole, and establishes a community, a peaceful society in which one particular individual in that society can flourish so that their nature can be fulfilled, so that they reach their end. The government itself doesn't become the end themselves. So, following this line of thought, human law itself should not prohibit all vice, but only the vices that pertain to the common good, the vices that pertain to everybody, not individual sins or individual vices. St. Thomas Aquinas says that the proper effect of law is to lead its subjects to their proper virtue, and therefore because you cannot give what you don't have. Society's leaders, the people who are leading us, those who are making these laws, those individuals should be virtuous, because if we are to follow them to achieve virtue, we can't follow people who are not virtuous, who are vicious, and then expect to come out on the other end virtuous ourselves. Furthermore, if those individuals are virtuous and they're passing laws that are virtuous or lead us to virtue, then we ourselves should have enough virtue ourselves to follow their particular lead, or else we won't benefit from the potential that those laws have to lead us to virtue. Now remember, I'm not speaking about particular individual interior sanctification. I'm speaking about the common good of the whole society. So all the members, the leaders of a society should be virtuous, and the members of a society should be virtuous enough in order to follow the lead of the virtuous leaders, the direction of those who are trying to lead them to virtue. Now, in the next video, we'll discuss man's freedom. Does the concept of law contradict the idea of human freedom? You can watch that video by clicking right here, and I'll see you over there. Does the existence of laws like natural law or positive law, civil law, all of these types of law that we've been discussing in this series, just their plain existence, the obligations that they put on man, do they infringe on our freedom? I mean, how can it be said